Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping straight into the pretty surprising results from the Canadian federal election.
Yeah, quite the turn of events.
We've got the initial projections, some news reports, and honestly, they're painting a picture that wasn't really what most people expected.
Not at all. The pre-election talk was definitely pointing in a different direction. So I think the big question we need to dig into for you today is what actually happened?
Right. What factors really flipped the script and gave the Liberals, under Mark Carney now, this win, especially when things looked so different beforehand?
Okay, let's get into it. So the headline is, Liberal Party wins, Mark Carney is the incoming prime minister.
And this is their fourth straight victory, which, you don't see that every day.
No, you really don't, especially in a G7 country. That kind of run is, well, it's pretty unusual.
And it was close, right? The reports suggest it's not totally nailed down if they have a full majority.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
looking tight. You need 172 seats for that clear majority out of 343 total. So, yeah, we might be looking at another minority government situation.
Hmm.
And you've got to remember the scale here. We're talking about, what, roughly 29 million eligible voters?
Wow.
Yeah, spread across 6 time zones. That always adds layers of complexity, different regional concerns. It's huge.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about something really unexpected that our sources are highlighting, the Trump factor.
Ah, yes, that definitely seemed to shake things up.
Because initially, the conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, they actually had a pretty solid lead in the polls, didn't they?
They did, yeah. The landscape looked, well, quite favorable for them going into the final stretch.
But then,
Well, then you had what the sources are calling a pretty aggressive intervention from the U.S. president.
aggressive how?
We're talking tough trade policies aimed at Canada, and even, remarkably, talk of annexation. Threats of annexation.
Annexation. Seriously, that sounds extreme.
It does. And according to the reports we're seeing, the impact was pretty immediate. A big shift in how Canadians were feeling.
It's like a backlash.
Sort of, yeah. It triggered what political scientists call a rally effect. You know, when there's a perceived external threat, people tend to rally around their current leadership.
Ah, okay. Unifying against an outside pressure.
Exactly. It seems Canadians felt their sovereignty was, well, being challenged directly, and they unified behind Carney.
Makes sense. And it wasn't just vague threats, was it? I read something about Election Day itself.
Yeah, apparently on the actual day of the election, Trump made a public call for Canada to join the U.S.
Wow. Talk about timing.
Yeah.
Right when people are voting.
It likely just amplified that feeling of external pressure, you know,
Okay.
and maybe boosted the desire for a leader seen as steady, experienced in these high-stakes international dealings.
Which brings us nicely to the leaders themselves. Let's talk about Mark Carney. He's new to leading the Liberals, took over from Trudeau.
Right. And it's interesting, he's not really a career politician in the traditional sense.
No, this was his first time even running for a seat in Parliament, wasn't it? And now he's Prime Minister-elect.
It's quite the trajectory. But what the sources really emphasize is his background outside politics, deep experience with crises.
Like what specifically?
Well, he headed Canada's central bank during the 2008 financial crisis. Then he was governor of the Bank of England through all the Brexit turmoil.
Okay, that's serious crisis management.
And more recently, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. So that resume, it carries a certain weight, especially when things feel unstable.
Absolutely. And his policy talk seems to reflect that global view too, right? Pushing for stronger ties with Europe, with Asia.
Yes, which you could definitely read as a strategy to maybe lessen Canada's dependence on the U.S. relationship, diversify a bit.
And it seems they connected with voters. The polls suggested people saw him as the better choice to handle Trump.
Apparently so. A majority felt he was best equipped to, stand up to that pressure. That perception likely became a huge asset once Trump jumped into the fray so loudly.
Okay, so what about his opponent, Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives? He's younger, 45.
Yeah, represents a different political generation. And his campaign style, well, the sources point out, it drew some inspiration from Trump himself.
How so? What was the platform?
Promises of lower taxes, cutting spending, hitting out at the media pretty hard.
Okay.
Warnings about radical left ideologies, promoting a Canada first kind of agenda. It's a familiar playbook in some ways.
It sounds it. And was that working initially?
It seemed to be, yeah. It was definitely resonating with a good chunk of the electorate, tapping into certain anxieties, certain desires.
But then Trump's actions kind of cut across that.
It looks that way. The sources suggest Trump's intervention might have fundamentally changed the election's dynamics.
It's interesting, right? Could Trump's own actions have actually hurt a candidate who was, in some ways, echoing his style?
That's a fascinating dynamic. So, okay, beyond the Trump drama, what were the big domestic issues? What were Canadians really focused on at home? Well, the reports highlight the usual suspects, really, but intensified. Inflation was a big one,
Still high.
persistently high, yeah. And related to that, the cost of housing, both renting and buying, just soaring.
It's tough. What else?
Access to healthcare, that's always a major concern in Canada. And debates around migration policy were also prominent. The real kitchen table stuff.
Right, the things that affect daily life directly. Okay, and then almost overshadowing the final days, there was this awful event in Vancouver.
Yes, just terrible news. A man drove his car into a crowd at a street festival for the Filipino community.
How many people?
At least 11 people were killed. Just tragic. They arrested a suspect, a 30-year-old man.
And do they know why?
The police have said, at least initially, that they don't believe it was terrorism, but the investigation is obviously ongoing.
Just devastating, and happening right at the end of the campaign.
Exactly. It must have cast a real shadow over everything, the national mood right as people were going to vote.
You wonder how something like that, completely separate from politics, might subtly affect things.
Absolutely. Does it change how people feel? Maybe the kind of leadership qualities they prioritize in that moment? It's hard to say, but it was certainly a somber backdrop to the election's close.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. It seems this liberal win, maybe unexpected based on the early numbers,
Definitely unexpected based on early numbers.
was really shaped by, well, external factors, mostly Trump's interference, which seemed to rally support for Carney.
Yeah, that looks like a major piece. Carney's crisis experience really seemed to resonate once that external pressure ramped up.
But at the same time, those core domestic issues, cost of living, healthcare, were still really important.
Crucial. And then you have the Vancouver tragedy adding another complex layer right at the end. A very surprising election, all told.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the sources really point to the unpredictable power of international politics spilling over into a national vote.
Precisely. And how a leader's perceived strengths, their resume, can suddenly become much more salient when things feel unstable or threatened from the outside.
So something for you to think about is just how much these external dynamics can shift an election's outcome, sometimes in really unexpected ways.
And maybe reflect on what qualities people look for in leaders during perceived crises, whether those crises are homegrown or come from abroad.
And what does this specific election tell you, perhaps, about the future of that really intricate relationship between Canada and the U.S.? Definitely a lot to chew on there.